Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to our week in review of the American Founders I wrote about just this week. Delayed a little bit, supposed to be at noon, about 12:08. I'm still getting the hang of going live on Sundays, clearly. I guess several decades worth of this being my day off has thrown off my ability to set a schedule on a Sunday. Hi Mr. Adams, hi Lucas, thank you guys for coming. Let's talk about the American Revolution, some American founders, shall we? Before we do, thank you guys for subscribing. I just hit 1,000 subscribers this week, which is absolutely amazing. So thank you so much. Let's get into it. If I can hit the button correctly. Here we go. Now, trying to get my heart in. Okay, let me take a sip of water. I'm sorry. What a poor way to start, right? Can't get my head in the game today. People are rolling in. We were just getting started. So, the Richmond Theater Fire. We have a little bit of a theme with these first few founders, and it is the Richmond Theater Fire. So, we're going to start off by saying hi TJ and hi Matt as you pop in. Thank you guys for coming. The Richmond Theater Fire is extremely interesting. So, the Richmond Theater Fire. The Richmond Theater Fire happened on December 26, 1811, the day after Christmas. And there was a theater in Richmond, Virginia, which at the time was the capital of Virginia, that burned down. And in it were over 600 people watching this show. And 72 people would die in the fire. It was just before the War of 1812 began. The nation was a little bit tense at the time, and this was an extremely important event, especially to Virginia, which at the time was the most powerful and wealthiest state in the young nation. So let's take a look at some of the background. First of all, we're going to talk about Alexander Playside, which we do not have an image of him, although he was at the time arguably the most famous actor in the United States of America. So a little bit of background on Playside. He was a famous actor in France. Not only was he an actor, but he was good at pantomime, and he was an acrobat, known specifically for tightrope walking, which is fascinating. He was also a very good ballet dancer, and he was born into a family of entertainers, and he would continue, obviously, in the family's business. In fact, he even spent 5 years in London where he entertained John Adams, who possibly, I'm not 100% sure, but was possibly the first, if not definitely one of the first Americans to ever see him perform. However, things got a little heated in France with the French Revolution coming up, so Playside left France and first goes to the Caribbean where he's performing in French colonies. Then he comes to the United States and he travels from New York all the way down to South Carolina in several different all the major cities, performing for the wealthy and the commoners alike. Eventually, he ends up in South Carolina for a while, where he is one of the proprietors of the more popular theater then. I believe it was called the Charleston Theater. There were 2 or 3 that popped up, and then they all conglomerate together. And he, Playside, runs those theaters for a while. Now, eventually, by 1811, he's getting older and he's not very well. And he ends up going to Richmond to do some performances where he actually becomes friendly with a young woman named Eliza Poe. And if that name rings a bell, it's the mother of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, while Edgar Allan Poe was still just a child, Playside becomes friendly with Eliza Poe, and they perform together, but Poe becomes very sick, and they do several benefits on her behalf while leading up to the fire. But in fact, Playside becomes sick also, so they end up having this benefit for him. Sadly, Eliza Poe, mother of Edgar Allan Poe, dies, and that pushes this particular performance for the benefit of Playside back a little bit. 3 days, in fact, to the day after Christmas. Now, they do have this performance. Sadly, when they have this performance, the building does catch fire. The way it catches fire is there was scenery that would be lowered and raised by children. Young boys were actually doing the lowering and raising, and one of the set pieces, back before there was electricity, was a chandelier with lit candles in it. And they pull up the candles, and it gets a little jammed, and the kid tugs on it, and that makes it sway, and it catches other set pieces that are hanging from the rafters on fire. Now this kid sees it and is just a boy, so he runs away. As he runs away, well, the whole building catches fire, all the set pieces. Now, it's hard for the audience to see it first, and when they do see it, they think it's just part of the show, until someone eventually runs on stage and says, "Hey, the set's on fire." And everyone goes, "Oh no," and panics, because back then there were not a lot of fire exits. There was a main entrance and exit on the ground floor, and then there was an exit behind the stage for the actors, and then there was a second floor balcony for the black citizens of Richmond, who were, of course, supposed to sit in a different area. So, as the times were. The building catches fire, and people, 600 people in an old wooden building try and exit, and they exit the best they can. And we are going to talk a little bit about a few examples of heroics and some sadness as we go along. Like I said, it's a little bit of a theme today. Eventually, the roof collapses in, and 72 people are killed. Now, Playside does survive, and his daughter, I believe it was Jane Playside, actually ends up to be one of the most all of his kids end up being actors, but his daughter Jane ends up being one of the most famous actors of the early half of the 19th century in America, spending a lot of time traveling the South, be really the number one traveling actress of the South at a time where theater was mostly traveling. There were not a ton of theaters, although I should note that Alexander Playside's role in Charleston made Charleston one of the top hubs of theater in early America. So that's essentially the outline of the story. It's a horrible tragedy. Everyone in Richmond, and again, Richmond is the capital of Virginia, the most popular, wealthy, important state at the time. James Madison is president. He just followed Jefferson, and he would be followed by Monroe. Washington was not long before. This is Virginia we're talking about. And everyone of prominence in Virginia was affected. Many famous people we've talked about here. St. George Tucker escaped barely with his life. A lot of names are escaping me now that I read through, because there was half of Virginia's society. The elites were there, but also many commoners, because 600 people is a ton of people. So that is the basic story of Alexander Playside. He would go to New York shortly thereafter and die just a few months later of the sickness that was ailing him. Unfortunately, I was unable to determine what sickness the benefit was for, but he dies very shortly thereafter of the ailment he was suffering from. So, that is Alexander Playside. And wrong button. Whoopsie daisy. Let's get over here. Again, Sunday mornings I'm still getting used to, or Sunday afternoons I'm still getting used to. Oh, and okie dokie. Well, it turns out this is not quite big enough. And whammy, now we look good. Sorry about that. And there's a good chance that's going to happen on every person we cover. So anyway, thank you for sticking with me. Let me click over here, and we are going to talk about George William Smith. George William Smith was the governor of Virginia when the Richmond Theater fire broke out, and he would die in the fire. So when I said super high levels of Virginia society were at the theater when it caught fire and 72 people died, the sitting governor of Virginia dies in the fire on the precipice of the War of 1812. So let's talk a little bit about Smith's background. He was an extended member through his mother of the Lee family of Virginia. It counts, though it was like very far away from the Lees were more accustomed to, the Richard Henrys and Francis Lightfoots and Light Horse Harrys of the war. But he does. His father was a member of the Continental Congress. Going to take a brief aside here. His father's name was Meriwether Smith, and we have Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark fame. I thought Meriwether was a strange name. By chance this week, I ran into two people whose first name was Meriwether on top of Meriwether Lewis, and then another person whose last name was Meriwether. There was like a Meriwether Jones. I didn't put, I was researching the article. I didn't want to get too distracted, but just side note, there were a lot of Meriwethers in Virginia, more than I anticipated. More than there were Tenches, which if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you know I love the name Tench and was fairly common at the time. Anyway, George William Smith was a politician on the rise. His father was a Continental Congressman. George becomes a Virginia House of Delegates, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates at a very young age. Basically becomes a career politician. By 1808, he had spent several years in the Virginia Assembly, and he is elected to the Council of State, which is essentially the governor's cabinet. And while he's there for several years and ends up becoming the senior member. So in theory, he's essentially lieutenant governor of Virginia for a few years. Now, he acts as governor twice before becoming governor. So when the term of John Tyler as governor of Virginia ends, George William Smith steps in temporarily until the next governor can come in. It seems like John Tyler wasn't super excited, so he left a little bit early because he lost. And James Monroe is elected for the second time, a decade after his first stint, as governor. George William Smith sits in for a few months until Monroe gets there. Now, Monroe is only governor of Virginia for about 2 months when he's chosen by James Madison, his buddy, to be Secretary of State, just as, like I said, no, it's a little bit early for the War of 1812. But his buddy says, hey, come be Secretary of State. So James Monroe becomes governor for the second time for 2 months. And he's like, I got better things to do, and leaves. So again, George William Smith, for the second time in less than 3 months, is acting governor of Virginia. And this time, the people just elect him governor because they're like, all right, hang out. You're doing a good job. Just stay around. Unfortunately, he doesn't actually take his seat until the beginning of December 1811, just 3 weeks before the fire. Now, the fire, as I said, kills a bunch of people. Obviously, George William Smith is one of these people. It is said, and this is hard to confirm, like many things with the fire is very hard to confirm, but it is said that George William Smith makes it out of the fire, but his son was still in there. So he actually goes back into the blaze, allegedly, as the story goes, to save his son, and neither of them make it out. And I do want to note that the death of the governor sends the country into disarray. I mean, war would be declared the following June for the War of 1812, but at this point, it's common. There's already the war hawks, the Henry Clays out there saying, let's get to war already. So with Virginia, I will repeat, being the most powerful, important state, Virginia's time in this position is very important. And actually, we are going to talk about James Barber, who takes over as the next governor. But very quickly, the lieutenant governor, Edmund Pendleton, I believe Jr. or Edmund something Pendleton, not the Edmund Pendleton who is more famous for his time in the Constitutional Convention, a nephew of his with the same name, takes over as acting governor and gets the legislature to very quickly have a special election and elect a new governor, James Barber, who we'll talk about briefly a little bit later. That is the sadly abbreviated life of Virginia Governor George William Smith. Let's move on to the next one. Let's see, is it too small? It might be. Nope. Okay, good. The other ones work. I only messed up one. All right. Gilbert Hunt. Our next founder is Gilbert Hunt, who was a slave in Virginia who was working as a blacksmith in Richmond when the Richmond theater fire broke out, and Gilbert Hunt becomes a hero for the first of 2 times in his life. Gilbert Hunt, he's about 30 years old at this point, and he runs over when he sees the fire break out. He's not in the building, he's working in his shop. He runs over where the building's on fire, and he helps save the approximately a dozen women. It's said that it was a dozen. The number may vary, but he runs over, and there's a Dr. James McCaw in the second story helping women out the window. And Gilbert Hunt runs over, and McCaw passes these women down to Hunt, who he helps to shuffle out and run away from the fire. And then just before the roof collapses, McCaw jumps down. Hunt catches him, but he jumped from a second story, so McCaw does end up breaking his leg, it sounds like, but he drags McCaw to safety just as the building's collapsing. And Gilbert Hunt becomes a hero. Now, I am not sure exactly when, but over the next decade or so, at some point, due to his work as a blacksmith, Gilbert Hunt is able to purchase his freedom, which is great. He also obviously is good at fighting fires, so he joins the volunteer fire department in Richmond. about a decade after the theater fire. There are obviously other fires, but there's another very big fire in Virginia called the Virginia State Penitentiary fire, where there are hundreds of criminals in the penitentiary when it catches fire. Gilbert Hunt goes to help fight this. Now, some prisoners are trapped, and Gilbert Hunt actually puts another firefighter up on his shoulders so they can crack a hole in the wall and save the prisoners from burning alive. And now we're not sure of the exact number of prisoners that were in there, but it is said that not a single person died in that fire, which is great. Now, Hunt, a blacksmith, there is a quote from him being surprised that the next day he was doing something he didn't expect to be doing, which was making as many handcuffs as he could so they could handcuff the prisoners so they couldn't, escape when there was no penitentiary to keep them in. So now we move a little past the founding, but Hunt has a really interesting life. So I am going to continue past the American founding era. In 1829, Gilbert Hunt moves to Liberia. Now, just as a reminder, Liberia was the one and only American colony in Africa. And the reason they started this, there was a company started called the American Colonization Society. President James Monroe was one of the leaders of this society, and the idea was there were people who were anti-slavery and wanted to figure out a way they could free the slaves without, as they saw it, destroying society, because they were very afraid of having former slaves and black people in general living amongst white people. They thought that could just end very poorly. Not my opinion, theirs. Now, I shouldn't point at Hunt either. I'm sure the black people would have been just fine with it. Although Hunt is an example of someone who had already been freed, and they started the Colonization Society in Liberia. The American government bought, or this, I should say, private company bought land in Africa. They named it Liberia because it sounds like liberty. And the capital of Liberia to this day is Monrovia, named after President James Monroe. It is the only capital of another nation in the world named after an American president. Fun fact. Many slaves are being freed and sent there. Many freed black people go there too. And Gilbert Hunt is one of these people. And he goes over to Liberia, and he's there less than a year and comes back because it's not great. They do a very poor job of colonizing. Not that colonizing, historically, when we look back on it, generally is not looked at in such a favorable light. The Americans do a notably poor job. They are not necessarily as brutal as some of the other nations colonizing sections of Africa. They are just kind of lazy about it. They don't put enough money or time into it. It just doesn't go very well. So Gilbert Hunt, having made a good amount of money at this point, buys his way back after less than a year. Now, he gets into some, I called it local fame in my article. Hard to call it fame. He becomes a little controversial in Virginia's free black community. He's involved with his local church. He becomes a leader of it. Then he gets kicked out of leadership. Then he comes back into leadership. Then he gets kicked out of leadership. It sounds like some people really, really liked having Gilbert Hunt, this hero, who was known locally as a hero a little bit because of his work with the fires. But some people, he seemed to have kind of a bad attitude. He was also arrested on several occasions, though he ended up never being tried. Charges were always dropped on the several occasions that he was arrested for selling liquor without a license. And yes, back in the mid-1800s, this is in the 1830s and 40s, and into the 1850s, you needed a license to sell liquor. And he didn't have a license, and he was selling it anyway. And that's fine, just fine. Either way, he continues, and near the end of his life, he dies in 1863. He lives to be very old, into his 80s. And near the end of his life, there's another author publishes under a pen name a book called Gilbert Hunt, The City Blacksmith. And this book pumps up Gilbert Hunt as a hero. And again, he was, but it seems that Gilbert Hunt dictated most of the book to this gentleman, who at the time was common to make people look way better than they actually were. Again, he was a hero for many reasons. I'm not trying to insult Mr. Hunt here. But, for example, they try and sell books by saying, help this old man who's hard on money and doesn't have a lot. When the truth is, this blacksmith was able to pie his way to and from Liberia, was a major player in his church, helped establish a graveyard, which he's not buried in, by the way. He helped establish a graveyard within his church, but gets buried in another graveyard, owing to his controversy within his church. He had money. As far as being a free black person, on the literally the eve, it was 1859, so the eve of the Civil War in Richmond, he had a fair amount of money. And so, but it was a tactic. There were many tactics used to sell the book, make him look better. So we do have to take a lot of what we read in the book with a grain of salt. But again, not taking anything away from this fascinating founder who then goes into, the second generation. He lives through the Jacksonian era. He dies in 1863. So he sees Lincoln become president. I'm not sure the exact date. If he sees the end of slavery, he would have been calling it pretty close to the Emancipation Proclamation there, because I believe the Emancipation Proclamation, again, I focus on the Revolution, but I believe it was December of 1863. I should probably know the exact date. Sorry. I focus in on one period of history, and we've kind of left that area. But so that's Gilbert Hunt, the enslaved blacksmith who was a hero of two fires. I hope you enjoyed that. I do see some comments coming in. Elijah Kramer, yes, he was there about 8 months. He arrives in early. I think it was the dates are eluding me. I apologize. It was in the late 1820s, but he arrives in like March and leaves by like September, because it's just not a lot of fun over there. Thank you, TJ. It is interesting. Scott Mitchell, thank you for hanging out from Scotland. Welcome. What time is it there? Are you before or after? I have a friend in New Zealand now who's like a day ahead of us somehow. Thank you guys for tuning in. Let's move on to another founder. And if I'm not mistaken, we're going to talk about 3 founders. Whammy. That's right. I took kind of an easy way out with this one. So, as I had mentioned earlier, when Governor George William Smith dies in the theater fire, the next governor, James Barber, takes over. And I was reading into him, and then I was reading about his brother, and then I was reading about his father, and I was like, I didn't know who to pick. So I kind of copped out, which I will do once in a while when I'm making these articles, and I wrote about all 3. I gave them all 3 a little paragraph, basically, because they were all interesting. First of all, you have Thomas Barber. Thomas Barber was the patriarch of the Barber family. He had like 15 kids with his wife Mary, who was a relative of the Pendleton family. Now, much like we were talking about earlier, Edmund Pendleton, who stepped in as temporary governor when Governor Smith dies, he gets his distant cousin to become James Barber becomes governor. But we're jumping ahead. Thomas Barber was in the Virginia House of Burgesses for several years leading up to the American Revolution. He had just a ton of different positions. Notably from my position was Sheriff of Onondaga. I live in Onondaga. Sheriff of Orange County, Virginia. He was also a neighbor. They were all neighbors of James Madison. And Thomas Barber is an early a mentor of sorts to James Madison, and in fact promotes him for certain positions, because James Madison was very young when the war breaks out. Madison joins local committees of correspondences and elected to the House of the Burgesses in his 20s. And one of the reasons for this is he has Thomas Barber really giving him the thumbs up, and people like that. Interesting enough, Thomas Barber, as sheriff, was the one who was supposed to deliver the news of who was elected to the Virginia government. And he did this, and it was James Madison, one of his proteges. He is kind of a role player, so to speak, in the Virginia government throughout the 1780s, but he has these 2 very important children. James Barber, whose name has already come up a few times. He is the one on your right, on the left. I can figure out right and left. The one on the left in this picture is James Barber. He is born 1 week before the Battle of Bunker Hill, to put some context into it. He grows up with a patriot father, and he joins the Virginia Assembly after studying law, and then he becomes, as we mentioned, governor of Virginia after the Richmond fire. And people seem to like him because he holds the position for most of the 18 teens, including most of the War of 1812. So he is a wartime governor of, again, the most powerful state in the Union during the War of 1812. He does see an invasion where Washington, D.C. is burned, but he is really important at recruiting men and money to fight and eventually win this Second American Revolutionary War, as it's sometimes called. He then goes to the United States Senate. He spends a decade as a United States Senate and holds the title of President pro tempore. And then when John Quincy Adams becomes president, James Barber becomes Secretary of War, based on his experience in the War of 1812 and his its importance in America at the time, leading into the second generation of American leaders. And his final thing in public, he actually goes to Europe and acts as minister to Great Britain for a while. One of the, then at least, most important diplomatic positions, for the first generation of American leaders. Now, he has a brother. Again, he had, I believe it was 10 sisters and 5 sons for Thomas. So they had 14 siblings. But his other brother that becomes very important is Philip Pendleton Barber. And again, we're leaving the Revolution a little bit here. But while his older brother, James, that we were talking about, and was serving in the United States Senate, Philip Pendleton comes and he becomes a member of the United States House of Representatives. So one sibling's in the Senate and one sibling's in the House of Representatives. And Philip Pendleton Barber, he spends 15 years there. He spends 2 years as Speaker of the House. He's actually one of the chairmen of the Judiciary Committee for a few years. Now, eventually, we get to President Andrew Jackson. Again, we're in the age of Jackson. We are leaving the Revolution a bit, and I apologize for that, but these are fascinating people. And I learned this week, so you're coming with me. President Andrew Jackson eventually names Philip Pendleton Barber, who is on the right here. He is named as a federal judge in Virginia. I believe it was the Eastern District of Virginia. Virginia, of course, had, at this time, I think 3 districts. The districts slowly got broken up over the decades to what we have now. He spends time as a federal judge, does a good job, and eventually is appointed by President Jackson as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So as just to wrap up, Thomas Barber, the father of these two gentlemen, was a Continental Congressman, not a Continental Congressman, I'm sorry, in the Virginia House of Delegates, a proponent of James Madison, and raises many children, 2 of whom one becomes governor and one becomes an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's a general overview of the Barber family of Virginia. I'm going to take a quick sip of water, if I may, while we move over to the next one, because we've already gone through 4 American founders. All right, and we are going to talk about Brutus, number 11. Okay, Brutus number 11. We've spoken about Brutus once a week for the last, now 10 weeks. I've been reviewing and writing one every Friday, and now we got to number 11. And finally, he spent a long time on taxes, he spent a few weeks on standing armies, and he now moves on to a new topic, the Supreme Court and the judiciary system in general. And he argues that the power given to the Supreme Court is a little too supreme, if I might. First of all, he talks about legalese. I guess that's the word I used, but he talks about these very lawyery words that are in the Constitution. And he notes that, he admits that, okay, I might not be the best lawyer in the world, but I have a pretty good handle on this, what's going on. But even I, and even the most intelligent lawyers in the world, disagree on the meaning of some of these very legal words. And from Brutus's perspective, who, by the way, is probably Robert Yates, but we're not sure exactly who it is, he discusses how no one really knows what these words are, and he accuses, for lack of a better term, the Federalists for taking advantage of how vague and ill-defined these words are to mold the Constitution into what they want it to be. He also basically says that they avoid any discussions by doing this. So if you'll say, well, the Constitution says this and this is no good, they will take these big lawyerly words and walk their way around and not ever answer your question because they just swim through this very difficult language, which, reading the Constitution can be difficult. And I mean, reading all this 18th century language can be very difficult at times, even Brutus, to be fair. But at the time, they understood it. Now, he goes into this and he says, part of the problem is it should be very specifically defined. It should be easier to focus on. Now, most of Brutus number 11 is focused on the word equity, which, again, I'm not a lawyer, but to get through the legalese, if you will, of this word, it essentially means that it's the judiciary of the United States is able not to just define what's in the Constitution and see if things are constitutional, but they're able to interpret things that are in the spirit of the Constitution. Quote, spirit is the term that Brutus uses. Because and he's nervous that, well, if the judiciary can look at the Constitution and say, I feel like it means this, then essentially the Supreme Court can be doing whatever it wants with no oversight, because the Supreme Court is the final decision. There's no way for the Congress, the House of Representatives or the Senate to overturn what they do. There's no way for the president to veto what they do. And in essence, what he thinks would happen is the Supreme Court would be able to essentially accumulate power and take over the United States government. Because even if they're not doing it maliciously, every person acts in self-interest. And even if a member of the Supreme Court is trying their best to be unbiased and do what's best for the people, they are going to naturally make decisions that will benefit them and their position. Especially if they've been given such a high role and said, it's up to you to determine what the Constitution says. Well, that's going to give people a little bit of a big head, if you will. And unfortunately, Brutus is extremely nervous about this, and he expects that over the years, the judiciary would essentially take control of the government, as I said. And that is a nice wrap-up of what Brutus is discussing in Brutus number 11, where he's talking about judicial power. Hope you enjoyed that. Let's move on to, we got two more founders. Now, if you're new here, and I do want to point out, Scott Mitchell, that is really cool that you are from the town where Hamilton's father grew up. I'm not familiar with Scotland, I will be honest with you. Let's move on to Bose Reed. Okay, so if you're new here, over the weekends, I only write new articles 5 days a week. So sue me. Over the weekends, I pull from my large, extensive archives of articles I've written in the past. So, Bose Reed. Bose Reed is the older brother of a more famous founder, Joseph Reed. Joseph Reed was an early member of the Continental Army, is the one who escorted George Washington to at least New Jersey on the way to get the Continental Army. Joseph Reed becomes president, but what we would consider governor of Virginia for several years, and a signer of the Articles of Confederation. Now, his brother, Bose Reed, today's subject, no known image, this is just a picture of a guy on a horse. Bose Reed becomes, he's from New Jersey, and he joins the militia, and he becomes a colonel in the New Jersey militia, and he raises his own battalion, and he leads them to war. But before he goes to war, he actually is commissioned with guarding Governor Franklin. Now, when you hear Franklin, you think Benjamin Franklin, but I will remind you, Benjamin Franklin's son, William Franklin, was royal governor of New Jersey. And as with many families, as I like to say, you talk about civil wars, the Civil War being brother versus brother. The American Revolution was almost more so, because at least the Civil War was North versus South. American Revolution was, okay, do you agree with the king, or are you against the king? And families disagreed. So Benjamin Franklin revolts against the king, and his son, royal governor William Franklin, likes being royal governor and sticks with the king. But Royal Governor Franklin is soon after independence arrested by the Patriots. And Bose Reed is the one who's charged with overseeing this particular very important prisoner. Now, he only holds on to him for a few weeks until his fate is determined and he is sent to Connecticut to get out of New Jersey where he has more friends. He's sent to Connecticut to be held as a prisoner and eventually exchanged for someone valuable. Now, Bose Reed then goes to war. He joins George Washington in New York. But then the Battle of Brooklyn is about to break out, also known as the Battle of Long Island. And right before the Battle of Brooklyn breaks out, George Washington goes, well, I sure don't want the British to get their hands on my stuff because I have some very valuable correspondence. It's not like Washington was being spoiled and saying, my stuff, my stuff. No, no. He had very important correspondence that could not be lost, as well as money that they just didn't want them to lose. Because, you know, there was a good chance they'd lose the Battle of Brooklyn. They do lose the Battle of Brooklyn, by the way. George Washington loses quite a few battles in New York early on in the war. That's neither here nor there. Bose Reed, however, is given a special task by General Washington: take my stuff to Philadelphia. And Bose Reed is given a sealed bearskin covered box. And I don't know why I'm so attached to that particular description of the box, but it is a bearskin box that he brings down to Philadelphia and gives to John Hancock, who was sitting president of the Continental Congress, to maintain George Washington's goods till after the war. Now, Bose Reed, again, from New Jersey, is there for quite a while, but eventually leaves his position as a colonel in the militia because he's elected Secretary of State of New Jersey. And he is actually Secretary of State of New Jersey for 16 years through several governors. And again, I like to remind you that until the Constitution is written and approved, each independent state looked at itself very much as an independent nation because they didn't have a constitution. There was not one government. So New Jersey was its own state. And as Secretary of State of New Jersey, not only was he supposed to handle the interior information in the state of New Jersey, but he was supposed to handle foreign correspondence. Now, the Continental Congress was, if it was doing one thing well, it was dealing with foreign nations. But again, the individual states saw other states as other nations. So Secretary of State Bose Reed was dealing with other states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, as if they were other nations. And he was, especially because the Continental Congress was dealing with overseas nations, these were the ones he was really dealing with. And well, he was there for 16 years, so he must have done a pretty good job. Eventually, the Constitution is ratified, and Jersey becomes a member of the United States, relieving the secretaries of each state of some of their duties, including Bose Reed, but he helps transfer New Jersey from essentially an independent nation into a united state. And I should note, he actually helped transfer New Jersey from a colony into a state, and then a state into one of the United States. So that is the overall assessment of the life of Bose Reed. I hope you enjoyed that. We're going to get down to our last one. And where are we now? We're only at 40 minutes. Go through them a little quick today. A little quick. Got off to a slow start, and I really picked up. Thank you guys for joining. Make sure you hit like if you're new here. If you're just popping in, definitely subscribe. I put out videos about the American Revolution all week long. And we play trivia on Fridays. It's a lot of fun. And we're going to end with Noah Webster. Noah Webster, famous for his dictionary, actually was an American founder, and that is often overlooked. He studies law as a young man in Connecticut, and he actually studies for a time under future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Oliver Ellsworth, who we've talked about on this channel. Oliver Ellsworth is one of the most important people in founding the judicial system itself in the United States when he was an inaugural senator. A U.S. senator. He also goes on to the Supreme Court real quick and ends up being a Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's who Noah Webster studies law under. And then afterwards, he just doesn't be a lawyer. He does join the Connecticut militia for a brief time, Noah Webster, but he doesn't actually serve and see any act. He serves, but he doesn't see any action. Again, he follows through on this legal studies and then doesn't want a legal career. And instead he moves to Goshen, New York, where he opens up a private school and he gets into education. And he is really most famous for his dictionary, but he is an educator first and foremost. He supplements his income by writing newspaper articles, but he gets a little frustrated with the education system. There was no education system at the time. It was left up to people who ran individual schoolhouses like Webster himself. But he sees America becoming America, and he wants to form an American identity, and he understands that one of the best ways to do this is to start with the children. And he writes a book called A Grammatical Institute of the English Language. It's a 3-volume work that focuses on educating children in this late 1700s on on spelling, grammar, and reading. And while he's doing this, he's starting the foundations of what would become his dictionary. So he puts this all together, and it becomes wildly successful. And it's one of the first school books written by an American for American children that is well read and well used. So Noah Webster, having written these school books, is essentially building what becomes an American identity. And he is not given a lot of credit for this. Now, his book becomes known as the blue-backed speller. That's just its general common term. Usually you won't hear it titled A Grammatical Institute of the English Language. You'll hear people reference the blue-backed speller, or you'll hear me reference it. Anyway, if you listen to a lot about Daniel Webster, that's how it's referenced. And this is the main book used for educating American children for the next 100 years. Now, I know he's known for his dictionary, but he is uniquely important to not only educating American children, but putting that foundation of being an American and American education into play. I can't stress enough how important Noah Webster is in creating an American identity. But he goes on to do more than that. You see, this is in the 1780s. He moves to New York, where he begins writing in support of this whole new constitution that is being questioned whether or not we should ratify it. And he actually relocates to New York because the writings he's doing in upstate New York for the Constitution impress Alexander Hamilton to the degree that Alexander Hamilton pays for Noah Webster to relocate to New York City, where he begins writing pro-administration articles for not only ratification of the Constitution, but then in support of the Washington administration. Noah Webster actually becomes one of the mouthpieces of Alexander Hamilton and by default the Washington administration in New York City. Additionally, he starts a paper called the American Minerva, which is sometimes called the Commercial Advertiser, which is the first daily newspaper in New York City. There were other newspapers published weekly. Some were published several times a week, but this is the first one published daily in New York City. So this all lays the groundwork for Noah Webster, and we finally get to him working on his dictionary. He starts his dictionary, he returns to Connecticut, and he joins the Connecticut House of Representatives, and by 1800 he starts realizing that not only, again, he's made a lot of money writing the most important school book of the first 100 years of the United States, but now he wants to do more. It's not just educating American children on how to be American. Now it's, okay, we need an American language because English in America was spoken differently than in England. And just 25 years before this, when the First Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia, they are a little bit, they have trouble speaking to each other. Delegates from Georgia and delegates from New Hampshire barely speak the same English. It's barely the same language. Now, this has changed a lot because of the Continental Congress, because America was being birthed, because so many soldiers were being sent north or sent south. The language itself was adapting. And Noah Webster took this and he created the first American dictionary. It's known as Webster's Dictionary. You have heard of it. I know now it's essentially been replaced by Wikipedia, but the Webster's Dictionary is one of the most important books in American history. Not only did it Americanize the spelling of certain words, like, you know how, like, color is spelled with a U in Britain and not in America? That can be traced back to Noah Webster. And it takes almost 20 years for him to write his massive dictionary that contained over 70,000 words. All by himself. He writes 70,000 words, he defines them, he spells them, Allegedly, he learned over 20 languages to trace the history of these words. That seems a little extensive and next to impossible. Though I'm sure he learned dozens of languages, because most of the elite American founders did know several languages. So, the first edition doesn't really have massive sales. Unlike his blueback speller, which took on very quickly, the dictionary sold slowly. It mostly went to people of higher learning in libraries and such, but eventually, as I said, it made its way into almost every American household for a while there, till Wikipedia came. Although I should have pulled it out. I have a Webster's dictionary. It's 20 years old, but probably pretty close, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of your relatives, for those of you younger, many of your relatives had a Webster's dictionary. So that is the story of Noah Webster. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, just to recap, Webster's known for the dictionary, but his blueback speller was one of the most important educational tools for the first 100 years of the United States. He wrote in support of the U.S. Constitution. Alexander Hamilton paid for him to move to New York City to write pro-Washington administration publications, and then he started 20 years of work on his dictionary. So that is Noah Webster. Make sure you hit like. I see someone just did. Make sure you guys hit like. If you're new here, definitely subscribe. I put out videos 6 days a week. Most of them are a lot shorter than this. I do actually cut this into clips that I put out through the week also, so it's a little bit easier to digest. Yeah, go live at 8:15 Eastern Standard Time each weekday. I have a bunch of interviews coming up with several authors. Jane Calvert is coming, I believe, this week. She is the one putting together the John Dickinson papers. I'm very excited to talk to her, especially about Dickinson's role in his view of women and how they should be treated equally in the government. Also, well, to a degree, not exactly the way we consider it today, but much better than most of the founders. And author Jean O'Connor is going to come talk about a novel she wrote about John Lovell. And actually, Michael Troy is coming back tomorrow. So we have lots of fun guests. Definitely hit subscribe. Matt, Noah Webster, definitely came up with Google it, I'm sure. You know what's interesting, Matt? I wonder if the word Google is in the original edition of Webster's Dictionary. So go check that out. Go find that out for me. Let me know. I've gone international. Yes, sir. Well, Matt, I actually have a few viewers that come in from there's one gentleman from Brazil. So yeah, we're getting there. The world likes us. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. It went a little bit quick. Usually this lasts an hour. If you guys have a question or anything like that you'd like me to respond to now, it'd be a great time. Because somehow it's 11 minutes early. I guess I talked really fast today. Summed it up nice, I suppose. If there is no questions, thank you guys so much for coming. Like I said, definitely hit like. There's 8 of you here right now, 7 likes. If we can get 9 likes, or that would be fantastic. Double thumbs up. Thank you again. I will be back again tomorrow night with another founder with Michael Troy. Actually, we're going to be talking about George Washington. Is he responsible for the color? So like he's not. I wouldn't say he's responsible for every word, but yes, at large, he Americanized a lot of spellings. I do believe color is his. Gray and gray, I think, are technically both still words. So I'm having trouble with that one. But even if he didn't directly do it, he's the one who first set down American English into Webster's dictionary. So even if it took a while for other people, for the language to catch up to what he was doing, yes, essentially, everything that we spell differently than other English-speaking nations in the world spell or pronounce. I guess not pronounce. What he was doing, essentially, was taking the way Americans pronounce words and spelling it that way, as opposed to taking just the original spellings or the way he thought it should be spelled. Because there were other people, and I believe Ben Franklin is one of these people. There were other people at the time who were trying to totally overhaul the language. They wanted to do things like get rid of the letter K, because we got C. What do you need K for? I don't remember exactly all the letters, but there was like I believe the letter Y seemed to be pointless. They wanted to, because it could be replaced with other vowels. They wanted to get rid of. I'll have to look this up. Maybe I'll write an article about it this week, because it's been a long time since I looked into it. But there are words with like 2 T's. Why is there 2 T's in a word? You only need 1 T. They wanted to simplify the language. But what Webster, as opposed to those people promoting that at the time, what Webster wanted to do was actually focus it around the pronunciation itself. New to the channel, largely the entire topic. Yeah, Scott, thank you so much for coming. Definitely subscribe. This is one of my longer videos. I do 2-hour videos a week. The other is Fridays. We do trivia, which is a lot of fun. This is a wrap-up of the articles I wrote this week. But throughout the rest of the week, we focus on one founder at the time. It's a real actual founder of the day instead of 7 founders of the weekend. So thanks again, guys. I'm going to take off now. I really appreciate all of you tuning in and your comments and your courtesies and all of that jazz. So thanks again. I'll be back with Michael Troy and some info on a young George Washington tomorrow. Round bottom.